Hello. So let's continue our summary of B.B. Price's medieval thought. This is the second video in the section on the first chapter, Christian Impress, this one dealing with the community. So, as I said last week, this chapter has 4 sections. We dealt with the first one on the medieval Christian as individual last week, and now this week we'll talk about the Christian community, and next week we'll do the last 2 sections on the social and religious context of Christianity and Christian texts, which are relatively short compared to the first 2 sections. So, the Christian community. As we noted earlier, the Christian community incorporated both Christians as social beings amongst fellow believers and the Catholic Church as the institution which formed the focus of the community. And the starting point to make here is that any religious community is defined by the beliefs and practices shared by its members. And at this point, Price makes what are essentially sociological observations on the importance of unity and belongingness, the importance of converts from the upper social strata, and the significance of literacy and the development of authoritative texts. So, first of all, unity and belongingness. The continued unity of a dispersed religious group depends fundamentally on the ability of its members to communicate with each other. Maintaining uniformity in the religious tradition and expanding the community both need communication. Prior to the invention of printing in the 15th century, and of course later technological advances, Europeans relied on either word of mouth or handwritten works to convey information. These required effort and time. In Christianity's early years, many of its rituals were practiced within a closed community, including aspects of prayer and the baptismal creed. It was assumed that those who were non-believers would not be able to participate without negative effects. By the 2nd century, making the sign of the cross with the fingers had become established practice. Shared signs and rituals implied shared beliefs, which did not need to be explained to fellow believers. With persecution, identifying signs of belief became more important so as to be able to identify a Christian's identity. Secondly, the importance of converts from the upper social strata. In Western Europe, converts were particularly sought among the upper social strata, as they would be able to shelter Christians in safety. Of course, the upper strata were also literate and so could write to each other. Thirdly, we have the importance of literacy and authoritative texts. Over time, textual sources became particularly important, more important than experience, along with notions of Christian orthodoxy, with correct practice and teaching depending on authoritative sources. By the 9th century, scholars were zealous to search through manuscript libraries in search of foundational texts. The written word became the basis for validating belief and practice, but included a consideration of their symbolic and ritualistic aspects. Whilst literate Christians desired access to the New Testament and the writings of early Christian hermits and patristic writers, this was not the case for the mass of the illiterate peoples. Another factor is increased standardization. Early transformation of the Western liturgy, the sacred service, provides a good example of how many aims and values could become incorporated into a single set of rituals. Initially, the components of Christian service had evolved separately from various sources, including Jewish rituals, Jesus' own words, the apostles' experiences, the believers' interpretations. By the mid-2nd century, however, a basic framework for the Mass was clearly described, whilst church leaders like Ambrose and Augustine argued against liturgical uniformity. Prescriptive documents appeared by the early 3rd century, seemingly written to maintain universal ritual practice, and to forestall change and innovation. The elements of liturgical scripture reading, a sermon, prayers, the Eucharist, and required rituals for baptism and prayers for ordination to various clerical positions, all were established. Texts and rules were to replace innovation and liturgical changes. By the 4th century, there were books specifically written for the Mass in circulation. Standardization included form, but also extended to language, with Damasus, a Bishop of Rome in the late 4th century, Latinizing the Mass, hitherto still conducted in Greek there. Inspired by Roman pagan rites and court practice, he and his successors also rendered a simple ceremony lengthy and formal. Scriptural extracts were extended, prayers prescribed at specific intervals. These changes brought unity and a sense of common identity among widely scattered Christian communities, but at the cost of variety, spontaneity, and regional expression. All of this had an impact on the laity. Liturgy had originally been the outgrowth of a sense of community, but gatherings now became so formalized that they were dominated by worship rather than fellowship. The new proceedings also barred the laity from a sense of participation. Use of Latin, decoration and ceremonious movements, and the erecting of screens in front of the altar were all devices to make liturgical activity inaccessible for the laity. Although not reduced to dependence upon signs and rituals, these codes provided continuity. In a predominantly illiterate community, signs remained extremely important for a sense of belonging and shaped Christianity's intellectual climate. This included pictorial representations in wall paintings and stained glass windows. For most Christians, symbols, signs, art, liturgy were far more important in defining Christian identity for the masses than any theology based on learned study of the Bible and the Church Fathers. The written materials were for the literate. Now let's move on to talk about communities within the Church. And basically these are two sets of communities. We have, first of all, the Church, the Roman Church, the ecclesia with its clergy and physical church buildings, and secondly we have the monasteries with their monks and nuns. So the Church, the formation of an institution in which certain individuals were responsible for performing rituals went hand in hand with the unification and codification of those rituals. This was the Church, the ecclesia, together with its clergy. The power of officiating in liturgy entailed the establishment of a church hierarchy. Clergy became distinct from laity, with the Old Testament's Levitical priesthood, with its ritual purity, becoming a strong model for clerical service. The apostles were seen as having originated the church, but their successors were not the members of the community as a whole, but only the clergy. Within the ranks of the clergy, bishops were designated to preside over the whole of the community and to administer the sacraments. Officially, they were to found new churches, ordain clergy, as well as to celebrate the Eucharist. The earlier positions of presbyters and deacons and those commissioned to minister to the sick and needy or to teach all came under episcopal administration. The position of bishop soon became politically important to the survival of the church. The alliance between the emerging Christian church with existing Roman institutions, regional, civic, and later imperial, had a great impact. The Roman administrative system became the model for the distribution of their power, with bishops linked to specific Roman dioceses and cities, and the dioceses being grouped together in provinces. Initially, there was no universal procedure for ordaining bishops, but many were chosen for more than their piety. For example, Ambrose, a member of an influential family, was persuaded to become Bishop of Milan in 373, even though he had not previously been baptized. But he had been elected governor of the surrounding region of Emilia-Liguria. The role of the bishops changed as the Western Empire collapsed. Secular involvement in the church increased to more than providing an administrative model. After Charlemagne, kings became protectors of the church and thus assumed the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The involvement of clergy in secular life also increased as bishops administered vast bishoprics and assumed political duties. A bishop might no longer be able to turn up for regular services at his cathedral. The church where his episcopal chair, his cathedra, was located, both his presence and even his role in the Mass had become remote. Initially, the clergy were relatively few in numbers. In 314, for example, there were apparently only 14 clerics in the whole of the province of Gaul. The idea that the clergy constituted a corporate body was slow to develop. There were particular collectivities, such as canons of a cathedral, but they considered themselves as independent groups. Only in the 8th century was a rule established specifying how all clergy should live and identifying a unity to all ordained priests. In the Middle Ages, priests were primarily charged with singing the divine office at specific times of the day and night, but they came to assume administrative responsibilities at the parish level also as part of the work of the bishopric that they belonged to, caring for physical property and real estate of local churches. Let's just mention also here the importance of physical church buildings. As Christianity evolved, the site of worship came to be almost as important as the ritual of worship. The church, in this sense, denoted the place of assembly or meeting. Buildings came to be designated and constructed to reflect the pragmatic and contemplative needs of Christian worshippers. They eventually included chapels for tombs, relics, and places of veneration for pilgrims, large porches for weddings, and raised altars for rituals of daily worship. Though they were often in the hands of lay believers, even under clerical ownership, they remained real estate. Tithes, offerings, and sworn endowments were used to build and maintain church buildings, and with general prosperity, religious edifices became an ostentatious expression of wealth and institutional strength, as well as signs of piety, and a place to welcome the poor and those, high or low, who only went to church or sermons occasionally. Now let's move on to the second main element, and that is the monasteries. By the 6th century, a new model of the Christian world emerged. During the early crises in the evolving Christian community, hermits and martyrs had provided role models, presenting a highly individualized solution to the threat of Christianity's survival. But as Christianity was adopted by the Roman Empire, a new model was needed and wasn't provided by the ecclesiastical hierarchy, seemingly too sophisticated and aloof. Often embroiled in worldly power plays, the clerics appeared to be morally lax and not worthy of emulation by the laity. Monasticism drew strength from its contrast with the clergy. In the 11th century, it was the reforming alternative to the growing administrative and legal preoccupations of the church. Most high church positions were becoming secured through the social, political, or educational sophistication of the individual appointed, rather than their spiritual commitment. The popes, as bishops of Rome, showed greater interest in secular involvement than in spiritual seclusion, so were more liable to being criticized for succumbing to such worldly temptations as avarice, venality, and power politics. There were then several waves of monastic fervor in the Middle Ages, monasticism being seen as a forceful means for eliminating the abuses and immorality of which the Roman Church was accused. In its birth, the Western monastic movement was focused on individual spirituality. Christians shouldn't be preoccupied with the world and its affairs, and the martyrs and hermits of the early church were the exemplars. But the Hermetic movement had raised practical questions. Only the most dedicated could cope with the rigours and hardship of total withdrawal from society. Instead, it had come to be considered that it was good to create Christian communities in which monks could prepare themselves for a more spiritual life, arming themselves against the vices of the world and their own evil thoughts. Thus thought Benedict of Nursia, a key figure in the rise of Western monasticism. The age of hermits had passed. His rule of poverty, chastity, and obedience for all in monasteries took its place. Life should be simple and free of distractions, including privilege and power. The movement led to an exclusivity of lifestyle, but it was well supported by the laity, some of whom emulated and copied its ideals and who turned to it for reform in the 11th century. It was not for everyone, and some regular clergy were disdainful of monasticism as a movement. Women, it should be noted, could also be initiated into the monastic system, excluding those who were married with children. And thus a number of women found it to be a way of expressing their faith whilst gaining education and being freed from the pressures of marriage and childbirth. In this regard, several famous women exercised their individuality through pious literary or artistic careers, including Hilda Whitby and Hildegard of Bingen. Price mentions some other eminent women monastics as well, but these are probably the two most famous. I should say it's well worth looking them both up in Wikipedia or somewhere to get an idea of how powerful and influential these women were. So anyway, many thanks to my patrons. And if you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to. Thank you for listening. Please do like the video if you do. Comment, share, subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. And if you want to provide practical support, you can do so through Patreon and PayPal. I'll give the links below. Next week, we'll move on to the third and final section of this chapter. Have a good day.